Hey guys, tonight we begin with something both familiar and unforgiving, the cold. Not the kind you dodge with a hoodie and central heating, but the raw, bone-gnawing frost of medieval Ireland. Imagine stone walls slick with damp straw roofs, dripping meltwater, and the sound of wind clawing like a stray cat at your doorway. You probably won't survive this, but let's try. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is that your home isn't really keeping the weather out. The frost isn't politely waiting at the doorstep. It has already marched in, clinging to rafters, coating the single tiny window with ice, and turning your breath into little clouds that puff and vanish before your face. Medieval Irish homes, stone bases topped with timber and thatch, were more like stubborn suggestions against nature than barriers. Archaeologists still argue whether the average peasant's hut was truly weatherproof or just tolerated because no one had anything better. Either way, your morning begins with a shiver. You rise from a straw mattress, flatten into something resembling a lumpy pancake. The straw crunches some of it frozen solid. Rats have tunneled underneath their tiny claws, scratching like invisible roommates. You try not to think about them, because in the hierarchy of winter, trouble's rodents rank below frostbite. Your body aches from sleeping fully clothed. Linen undergarments, if you even had them, are stiff with yesterday's sweat. Over them hangs wool, rough and itchy, coated in lanolin grease that helps against rain, but also makes you smell like a sheep who's had a hard week. Step barefoot onto the floor, and you're immediately reminded that this isn't hardwood, it's compacted dirt. Overnight, frost has risen from the ground itself, creeping through the floor like an uninvited ghost. You hiss at the sting and quickly pull your rag-wrapped feet back onto the bedding. No socks, no slippers, no plush carpet, just dirt and cold. Historians still argue whether peasants routinely spread rushes across their floors as insulation or whether that was a luxury saved for wealthier families. Either way, the frozen ground laughs at your discomfort. Outside dawn is more rumor than reality. The sky is a pale smear of gray, and the sound of crows echoes across empty fields. Winter has stripped the landscape bare. Trees stand as skeletal reminders of warmer months, and the fields, usually buzzing with activity, are locked under a white crust. The village looks half asleep, smoke only beginning to curl from a handful of hearths. You know, each plume represents a small victory, another family who managed to keep their fire alive overnight. Fail at that, and your morning task is desperate, striking flint on steel, coaxing sparks onto damp kindling, and praying the ash-banked embers still smolder under yesterday's layer. The frost presses against the hut's walls. It seeps in through every crack, eager to settle into your bones. It doesn't matter how many layers you pile on, the cold always wins. The Irish word for winter gaimred carries a sense of endurance rather than mere season. It wasn't something to enjoy. It was something to survive. A modern aside, think of your apartment, thermostat set at a stubborn 52 degrees, and your landlord telling you it builds character. You crouch by the hearth. A shallow pit, some charred logs, and smoke already stinging your eyes. The fire is life. Without it, frost claims your fingers. Your breath grows shallow, and sleep becomes a gamble you might not wake from. Parents whisper prayers while banking the embers, covering them in ash before bed so they last until dawn. It's part faith, part technique. Some say too much ash suffocates the flame. Others insist the tighter the better. Scholars still debate whether medieval manuals of household management offered consistent advice or whether each family simply hoped their method worked. The air smells of damp wool smoke and something earthy you don't want to name. Your nose runs not from sickness, but from cold so sharp it cuts like onions. In the distance, you hear the bleating of cattle huddled in buyers' barns, made of the same leaky thatch as your home. Livestock aren't just animals here. They're mobile heaters, their breath clouding in the chill, their bodies radiating warmth. Later sections will bring them closer, sometimes right into the living space. But even now, their presence is a reminder survival is communal. Your stomach growls, but breakfast is still hours away. First chores. You step outside, and the frost greets you with a crunch beneath your feet. The ground is slick, the air so still it feels heavy. Every inhale freezes in your chest. Every exhale fogs your vision. The horizon shows mountains capped in white. Somewhere, snow has already drifted high enough to trap entire hamlets. Oral tradition speaks of winters so severe, rivers froze solid, and people walked across them as if crossing stone bridges. Historians still argue whether those tales were exaggerations, but in this moment you don't care. The cold is real. The sounds of the village rise slowly. Someone splitting frozen wood with dull thuds. A child crying from the shock of icy water on their face. A rooster whose crow seems hoarse in the chill. Even nature sounds different in winter. Birds chirp. Less dogs bark more softly. And the silence between is immense, pressing against your ears until you wonder if the world itself has paused. You glance back at your doorway. Frost has crept over the threshold, turning the timber frame white. There's no sense of indoors and outdoors here. Just two versions of cold, the biting wind outside, and the smoky, cramped damp inside. Every decision, when to fetch water, when to split wood, when to tend animals, becomes a calculation against the frost. Too slow, and it costs you warmth. Too careless, and it costs you life. And yet, despite this hostile beginning, people endure. The Irish peasantry faced winters year after year, armed with stubbornness ritual and the faint hope that spring would return. For now, though, the frost has the upper hand. It sits at your doorstep, grinning ready to follow you back inside. And you, shivering in the half-light, are only at the beginning of this long, unmerciful season. The frost hasn't finished with you yet. It lingers, clinging to every surface. And when you look up, you realize the roof itself is part of the conspiracy. Thatched roofs, layers of straw reeds, or heather bound tightly together form the main shield between you and Ireland's relentless winter sky. In theory, they're clever, lightweight, renewable, and surprisingly insulating. In practice, they sag under snow leak, under rain, and occasionally provide lodging for wildlife you didn't invite. You tilt your head back and watch a drip of icy water snake its way through the straw land on your face and remind you that medieval architecture wasn't exactly cozy. For Irish peasants, a roof wasn't decoration. It was survival. Thatched roofs were common because Ireland's bogs and fields offered plenty of reeds and straw. Stones were precious wood, scarcer still in many regions, so the top half of the house came down to what could be gathered after harvest. The thatch was piled thick, tied down with ropes of twisted straw or hazel rods, and weighted with stones so winter winds didn't peel it off like a careless blanket. Historians still argue Whether families replaced the thatch every year or patched it seasonally, but either way, the work was endless. A storm could undo months of labor in one night. The problem wasn't just water seeping in, it was what came with it. Moisture breeds mold, and mold, in an enclosed, smoky hut, becomes a silent guest in your lungs. Children coughed, elders wheezed, and a winter's dampness could tip a frail body into pneumonia. And yet, when you're living in a land where rain is practically a national anthem, you learn to shrug. A leak above your bed. Shift slightly and hope it drips on your cousin instead. A rat scrambling across the rafters. At least it means the thatch is thick enough to support life. Scholars note that in Irish folklore, roofs are often described as alive, and not metaphorically. The creaks, drips, and rustles reminded people that they were sharing space with more than just family. Step outside, and the roof looks picturesque in the snow. A cottage capped with a thick, golden mane, smoke curling lazily from its smoke hole. From a distance, it could be charming. Up close, you notice the sagging ridge, the frost clinging to straw tips, and the occasional crow tugging out loose thatch for its nest. The roof is a battlefield, and every winter, storm is a siege. Inside, you duck your head, because medieval roofs sloped low, often brushing the tops of taller men's hair. Heat rises, but in a thatched hut, it doesn't get far. Smoke gathers in the rafters, curling into your eyes until they sting. Some historians still argue whether smoke served a secondary purpose, fumigating insects in the thatch. If that's true, then every tear you shed by the hearth was also pest control. Not the kind of comfort you'd advertise, but better than lice colonies above your head. When the wind howls, you hear the roof strain. Thatch rustles like a restless blanket, ropes creak, and the whole structure groans. The walls waddle, and daub-smeared mud over wooden lattice don't help much. They hold up the roof, but can't silence the gale. On stormy nights, you lie awake, wondering if the thatch will hold or peel away, leaving you exposed to the night sky. And yet, despite its flaws, the thatch works. It keeps most of the rain out, most of the snow off, and most of the heat in. In a medieval Irish winter, most is victory. You pull your cloak tighter and imagine the sound of dripping water, like a lullaby. Not comforting, but constant. The roof sets the rhythm of your days, dripping in thaw, creaking in frost, whispering when the wind slides through. Every family member knows the weak spots. Children shift bedding away from leaks. Parents stuff fresh straw into gaps, hoping to buy another night of dryness. There is no such thing as a watertight guarantee. The roof teaches you endurance, not comfort. Here's the quirky part. Some families actually stored food up in the rafters. Smoked fish, strips of meat, even herbs dangled above, suspended in the smoky haze. Practical, yes. Hygienic, debatable. Rats certainly thought so. Scholars still argue whether roofs doubled as food storage across Ireland or just in poorer households. But the evidence lingers in folklore tales of stolen bacon vanishing into the thatch, carried off by something unseen. Step back and imagine the contrast with noble halls, castles of the Gaelic lords, or later Anglo-Norman settlers boasted stone roofs, slate tiles, and lofty beams. They still leaked, but not as badly, and servants, not children, scrambled to fix them. The peasant's thatch was disposable, patched by hand, replaced as needed, and cursed with every drip. Yet it was also beautiful in its way, golden in autumn dark, and matted in winter, alive with the memory of harvest. So tonight, as you listen to the roof, drip and creak, remember survival wasn't about perfection. It was about patchwork resilience. A leaky roof still meant a roof. And in a land where frost presses against every doorway, even flawed shelter was worth everything. The walls around you don't exactly inspire confidence. They aren't stone fortifications or sturdy timber planks. They are wattle and daub thin wooden stakes, woven like a basket smeared over with mud straw and sometimes dung to hold the whole thing together. In the summer, these walls look rustic. In winter, they feel like betrayal. The frost presses in, and the mud cracks, leaving thin gaps where the wind whistles through like a bored ghost. You run your fingers along the wall and feel dampness seep through. It's not indoors or outdoors. It's somewhere in between, a fragile compromise between human effort and Irish weather. Peasants lived with these walls because they were cheap and quick. Ireland's forests had already been heavily cut back by the Middle Ages, leaving less timber for common folk. Stones were hoarded for churches and castles, not peasant huts. Mud, however, was everywhere. Mix it with straw, slap it on a woven frame, and you had shelter. Not comfort shelter. Historians still argue whether these houses were meant to be rebuilt every generation or patched indefinitely. But the consensus is clear: they weren't built to last. And yet people kept patching, kept smearing new layers of mud each season, like reapplying makeup on a cracked face. On freezing nights, you sit inside and watch the walls sweat. Moisture condenses on the inner surface, drips down in slow lines, and pools at your feet. The smell is earthy sour and faintly animal from the dung mixed in for binding strength. Modern architects would faint. Medieval peasants just shrugged. If the wall still stood, it was good enough. And if it leaned dangerously after a storm, well, that's what neighbors were for, propping it back up with spare poles until the thaw. There's a certain comedy in it. You can patch a crack in the wall with moss-old cloth or even bread crusts hardened from last month. Children sometimes did it as a chore, stuffing gaps with whatever material was on hand. Picture yourself pressing scraps into a hole while the wind hisses at your fingers. The house breathes with you. Every gust rattles the frame. Every draft reminds you that nothing here is sealed. Historians still argue whether these drafts actually helped by venting smoke from the hearth. Maybe they did. Or maybe that's just medieval spin on bad insulation. The thinness of the walls had social consequences too. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Sound carried through mud like gossip through a small village. Your neighbors could hear your baby crying your prayers at night, even your arguments. Conversely, you could hear theirs echoing faintly, as if the whole hamlet were one connected house. The walls divided space, but they didn't separate lives. Survival was communal, and the architecture reinforced it. Sometimes walls weren't even full height. Archaeological evidence suggests smaller huts, their walls barely taller than a person. You stoop, you huddle, you live compressed. Lower walls meant less space to heat, but also more claustrophobia. On a stormy night, crouched in smoky half-dark, you might feel less like you're in a house and more like you're inside a stubborn mud cocoon. But when the wind roars outside, even that cocoon is a blessing. Curiously, these walls had one unexpected perk: pests. Not fewer of them, but easier to control. Fleas, lice, and mice thrived in the straw bedding and thatch, but sometimes the smoke-stained, dung-coated walls discouraged larger animals from squeezing through. Not exactly a feature you'd brag about, but in a world where wolves prowled outside, you took what small victories you could. Scholars still debate whether wolves ever broke into peasant huts, but folklore is full of stories warning children to keep doors barred tight. If the walls couldn't keep out the cold, at least they might keep out teeth. So you sit surrounded by mud walls that are neither firm nor fragile, and you realize something: they represent resilience. They crack, they sag, they leak, but they are rebuilt. Year after year, hands smear fresh layers over the old filling gaps covering scars. It's not permanence, it's persistence. And that persistence is the real defense, thin, as it seems, against a winter that never stops testing you. The hearth is more than a fireplace. It is the heart of the house. Without it, winter in medieval Ireland isn't just uncomfortable, it's impossible. You crouch beside the shallow pit of glowing embers, feeling the first lick of warmth against your hands, and suddenly the damp walls and dripping roof matter less. Fire means survival. Fire means you might see spring. The hearth isn't grand. Forget carved mantels or chimneys. It's usually just a dugout pit in the floor, circled with stones, filled with whatever fuel the family has managed to scrape together: peat wood, if you're lucky, or dried heather. The smoke curls upward, and then sideways because there is no flue to guide it. Instead, it fills the room, creeps through cracks in the walls, and stings your eyes until they water. But that smoke, irritating as it is, has a hidden purpose. It drives away pests from the thatch above, kills fleas in the bedding, and coats everything with a preservative layer of soot. Scholars still argue whether this accidental fumigation was intentional design or happy accident, but either way, you breathe it every day. Gathered around the fire, your family becomes a circle of silhouettes and flickering orange. Parents, children, and grandparents huddle close, the only warm zone in a house otherwise chilled to the bone. The fire is kitchen heater and sometimes lamp. A pot dangles on a crude iron hook, bubbling with pottage, the eternal stew of grains and roots that never seems to empty. The smell is smoky, earthy, occasionally appetizing, occasionally suspicious. But you eat it anyway, because the hearth provides, and winter doesn't allow choosiness. Banking the fire each night is a ritual. Just before bed, you carefully bury the embers in ash, insulating them so they smolder until morning. Do it right, and dawn greets you with a faint glow to coax back into flame. Do it wrong, and you wake to cold ash, forced to spark a new fire with flint and steel fumbling in the dark with numb fingers. Families passed down fire banking techniques like heirlooms. Some swore by a layer of damp ash. Others insisted only dry ash kept the fire alive. Medieval households debated this with the same passion modern families reserve for thermostat settings. And the fuel, always the fuel. In Ireland, forests had been thinned, so wood was precious. Peasants turned to peat, cut from bogs, dried into blocks, and stacked like treasure. Peat smolders, slowly giving off a steady heat and a thick, earthy smoke. Your clothes reek of it. Your hair soaks it in, your walls turn brown with it. But when frost bites and the wind howls, you bless every smoky breath. Historians still argue whether peat cutting strained the land's resources long term. But to a medieval villager, it was simple: no peat, no fire. No fire, no life. The hearth is also social. Evenings stretch long in winter, and with no candles for peasants, the fire is the only light. You sit in its glow, telling stories of heroes like Cú Chulainn, or whispered tales of fairies lurking in the bogs. The flames' dance shadows loom, and children listen, wide-eyed, half terrified, half comforted. The fire doesn't just warm bodies, it warms imagination. Sometimes, though, the hearth betrays you. Sparks leap out, setting straw mats alight. A gust of wind sends smoke back into the room, choking you awake in the night. In cramped huts, livestock wander close to share warmth, and a careless cow can knock over embers. Accidents happen, huts burn, and families rebuild with the same stubborn persistence. Fire is dangerous, but so is its absence. Modern comparison. Imagine every meal, every conversation, every flicker of hope centered on a single wood stove. Now remove the stove's safety features, double the smoke, and put it in a house made of mud and straw. That was the medieval hearth, comforting, perilous, indispensable. Still, you return to it each evening. Knees drawn close, hands stretched out, watching sparks rise into the dark rafters. Outside, the frost gnaws at the world. Inside, the hearth pushes it back inch by smoky inch. The fire doesn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival isn't even a question. So you sit a little longer, feeding the flames, whispering prayers that tonight, at least tonight, the fire holds. Night falls early in an Irish winter. The sky darkens before you've even finished your evening chores, and soon the hut is swallowed in shadows. The fire is still alive, glowing stubbornly in its pit, but bedtime brings a new ritual banking the coals. It's not optional. It's the razor's edge between waking to warmth or waking to ice in your lungs. You kneel by the hearth, the smoke stinging your eyes, and begin the careful process. The embers are banked with ash, covered just enough to choke the flame, but not smother it. Too much ash, and you'll wake to dead coals. Too little, and the fire flares, uncontrolled, devouring precious fuel while you sleep. It's a balancing act every family member learns young. Children watch parents demonstrate, then are scolded when their clumsy hands waste kindling. Survival is a skill set, and this one is mandatory. The logic is simple: ash insulates. It traps the heat, lets the coals glow through the night, and gives you something to coax back to life at dawn. But of course, medieval life never does simple. Each family swears their technique is best. Some spread the embers wide and sprinkle ash lightly. Others pile the ash thick, pressing it down like tucking a child into bed. Historians still argue whether regional customs shape these variations or whether villagers just liked quarreling about fire the way we bicker about sports teams. When you bank the coals, you're not just tending fire, you're buying time. Ireland's winters are long, damp, and punishing. To lose your fire means fumbling with flint in the dark, striking sparks, with fingers already numb, praying the kindling is dry enough to catch. If it doesn't, you might trudge to a neighbor's hut, beg a glowing coal, and carry it home in a pot like a sacred relic. That act, borrowing fire, was common enough to enter folklore. People remembered which families always had good coals, who could be relied upon to share, and who selfishly turned visitors away. Fire wasn't just fuel. It was social currency. You glance at the ash heap, hearing the faint crackle beneath. The coals breathe like a sleeping animal. If they survive the night, you survive the night. Fail, and you greet dawn with frost on your blankets, your breath fogging in the smoky dark, and your family huddled in misery. There's no romance in it, just cold calculation. The superstition side of banking the fire lingers too. Some villagers whispered prayers as they pressed down the ash, invoking saints or local spirits to guard the flame. Others spat lightly on the coals for luck, believing moisture carried blessings. Scholars still argue whether these practices were remnants of pagan ritual or just habit dressed in faith. Either way, the coals were treated with reverence. They were alive in their way, alive enough to demand care. A modern aside, Imagine leaving your phone on 1% battery overnight, but instead of plugging it in, you cover it with a blanket and hope it still has charge in the morning. That was banking the coals, an anxious gamble every single night. The hut quiets. Family members shuffle onto straw pallets, livestock shift in the corner, and the only sound is the muffled pop of buried embers. You lie awake for a moment, staring into the dark, half wondering if the fire will hold. And when your eyes finally close, your last thought is simple. Please, let the coals still glow when morning comes. Because without them, dawn will be cruel, and winter even crueler. The hut grows quiet after the coals are banked, but warmth is never guaranteed. To fight the chill, people turn to the oldest and simplest solution: each other. Sleeping in herds isn't poetry here. It's the literal nightly strategy of survival in medieval Ireland. You slide onto the straw pallet, pressed shoulder to shoulder with family members. Children nestle in the middle, parents flank them, and grandparents hover at the edges. If animals are indoors tonight, and they often are, they join the heat-breathing steam into the air. Privacy isn't a concept. The hut becomes a human and animal lasagna, layered for warmth, improvised insulation against the frost clawing through mud walls. The science is simple, even if no one called it that: body heat. One person in a freezing hut loses warmth quickly. 10 people packed close create a bubble of livable air. The inside of the pile feels almost cozy humid, with breath pungent with wool grease and smoke. The edges are brutal. If you're unlucky enough to sleep near the wall, icy drafts gnaw at your back. Shift too far toward the center, and you're accused of hogging the warmth. Medieval knights came with their own politics. Folklore hints at arrangements. Stronger men often slept on the outside, taking the brunt of the cold, while children and elders were shielded in the center. Scholars still argue whether this was custom or just necessity, but oral tradition remembers families placing infants beneath cloaks at the warmest point of the pile. Every night was triage: who needs the heat most, who can endure the cold, who snores loudly enough to get shoved closer to the door. And then there were the animals. Cows, goats, pigs, anything with a pulse and a bit of warmth was welcome. Imagine lying half asleep while a cow shifts beside you, exhaling hot breath like a reluctant furnace. Goats nudge chickens, flap in the rafters. Pigs grunt from the straw. It sounds chaotic, but the alternative is frostbite. Parents didn't debate whether the smell was tolerable. Smell doesn't kill you. Cold does. You can picture it: the straw beneath you, crunching the air thick with smoke and sweat, the chorus of snores, moos, and bleats blending into a strange lullaby. Comfort isn't the goal, survival is. And somehow, pressed together in the dark, people did survive. Of course, the situation had its hazards. Parasites spread easily in close quarters. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived, leaping from person to animal and back again. Children woke scratching, mothers sighed, and everyone tolerated the constant itch. Historians still argue whether smoke from the hearth truly reduced infestations, or if that's just optimistic hindsight. Either way, no one escaped unbitten. A modern aside, think of a crowded overnight train with broken heating. Strangers and friends alike crammed into one compartment, breathing the same air, bumping elbows. Now, add livestock and subtract deodorant. That's medieval group sleeping in a nutshell. And yet there's tenderness too. Families whispered stories in the dark. Songs drifted softly. Prayers murmured before sleep. Children pressed close, felt safe, not just warm. Grandparents told tales of winters past, of storms survived, of saints who lit fires with miracles. The herd wasn't only survival, it was memory, comfort, continuity. Occasionally, mischief broke through the monotony. Someone shifted too much, jostling the whole group. A child kicked in their sleep, setting off a chain of complaints. A goat sneezed, showering straw on faces. Even in exhaustion, laughter rippled. Because sometimes the absurdity of it all, living like bundled livestock, was the only way to endure. When morning came, the herd stirred slowly, each body stiff from immobility, each face marked with straw lines. But they had made it. Warmth had been borrowed, shared, recycled through breath and skin. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. And in medieval Ireland, that was enough. You pull the cloak tighter, rough wool scratching against your neck. It's not soft, not stylish, and definitely not clean. But in medieval Ireland, this cloak is as close to central heating as you'll ever get. Made of wool, thick with lanolin, the natural grease left in after minimal washing, it repels rain, clings to warmth, and smells faintly of sheep that have seen better days. And tonight, as frost gnaws at the door, it's the only thing standing between you and the chill. Wool was the miracle fiber of the Middle Ages. Ireland's climate, wet, windy, and rarely forgiving, made sheep essential. They provided meat, milk, and most importantly, fleece. Spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and cut into cloaks, wool was everywhere. But unlike the clean sweaters you're imagining, medieval cloaks were coarse, heavy, and oily. Lanolin, that stubborn grease, was both blessing and curse. It made the fabric water-resistant, turning drizzle into harmless beads that slid off, but it also clung to every fiber, giving the garment a permanent damp farmyard odor. Historians still argue whether peasants intentionally preserved the lanolin or simply lacked the means to scour it out. Either way, the result was the same cloaks that kept you alive, if not exactly fragrant. Cloaks weren't just clothing. They were blankets, raincoats, and sometimes mattresses. You slept, wrapped in them, traveled under them, and if desperate, huddled with others beneath one, large enough to cover 2 or 3 bodies. Archaeological finds and illuminated manuscripts show peasants swaddled in simple rectangular wool cloaks, pinned at the chest with a brooch or clasp. Nobles wore finer versions dyed in bright colors, but for common folk, brown, gray, and sheep's wool, white dominated. When a storm howled through, color didn't matter. Thickness did. You can imagine stepping outside at dawn, frost crisp on the fields, and pulling the cloak around you like armor. The lanolin stiffens in the cold, making the fabric almost waxy. Your breath fogs into the wool, dampening it further, and soon you carry the mingled scents of smoke sheep and your own sweat. Yet despite the discomfort, you're grateful. Without the cloak, you're naked before winter. With it, you're at least a contestant in the survival game. Of course, cloaks came with problems. They were heavy sometimes, so soaked with rain they doubled in weight. Walking with a wet wool cloak felt like dragging a reluctant dog behind you. Drying them was another challenge. Hung too close to the hearth, they smoked and scorched. Left in the open air, they froze, stiff, turning into woolen boards. You could practically stand upright against the wall. Families often rotated cloaks, draping damp ones, while wearing slightly less damp ones in an eternal cycle of soggy resilience. Underneath the cloak, layering was essential. Linen shifts, if you had them, offered a first barrier, but linen was cold when wet, and in Ireland wet was constant. That's why wool ruled. Even damp wool still insulated. Farmers knew this intuitively, watching sheep graze cheerfully through mist and drizzle while humans shivered nearby. You weren't just wearing a cloak, you were borrowing a sheep's survival strategy. There's a quirky tidbit here. Grease from wool wasn't just tolerated, it was sometimes valued. Lanolin softened hands, chapped by frost-healed cracks in the skin, and waterproofed more than fabric. Some Irish households even used excess wool grease for makeshift ointments. So when your cloak smelled like a barn, it also doubled as medieval moisturizer. Modern historians still debate whether this was common knowledge or simply a byproduct of grime. Either way, peasants were inadvertently skin-caring while trying not to freeze. Cloaks also told stories. A well-patched cloak meant resourcefulness, evidence of careful mending with scraps of old cloth or different colored wool. Some cloaks became family heirlooms, passed down through generations, each patch a memory of survival through another winter. In sagas and songs, cloaks carried symbolic weight. A warrior gifting his cloak to a companion showed loyalty. A chieftain wrapped in dyed wool displayed power. And in everyday huts, a mother pulling her cloak over her children at night showed fierce, ordinary love. The scholarly debates around cloaks extend beyond materials. Some argue that the Irish brat, a type of large woolen cloak, was iconic enough to define the culture. Roman writers described Irish travelers wrapped in thick brats, sometimes nothing else, braving winds that would cripple others. Was this stereotype or truth? Archaeology leans toward truth. Textile fragments suggest cloaks woven wide and long enough to cover the body entirely, a wearable tent against rain and frost. Imagine curling up inside one lanolin, sticking to your cheek smoke, clinging to every thread, and knowing this scratchy rectangle is the only barrier between you and hypothermia. A modern aside, picture yourself in a camping trip gone wrong. The sleeping bag is soaked, the tent leaks, and all you have is a greasy old blanket that smells faintly of livestock. Would you complain? Yes. Would you use it anyway? Absolutely. That's the medieval cloak experience misery that you thanked every day. Sometimes cloaks even crossed into law. In early Irish legal texts, the Brehon Law's cloaks appear as items of value mentioned in compensation disputes or fines. A stolen cloak wasn't just an inconvenience. It was theft of survival. Punishments could be severe, because the loss could mean death in the next frost. Owning even one decent cloak separated the merely cold from the dangerously exposed. At night, cloaks transformed again. Spread across straw beds, they became communal covers, stretched over bodies pressed together. Children nestled under edges. Animals sometimes leaned against them, and frost dripped harmlessly onto greasy wool instead of bare skin. The cloak became both roof and wall personal armor in a hut already losing its battle against the cold. By dawn, the cloak is heavier, smokier, maybe even crawling with fleas. But you shake it out, pull it tight again, and step into another day. You don't love it. You don't boast about it, but you owe it everything. The cloak doesn't care if you're noble, or peasant strong, or weak. It covers you anyway, a scratchy, greasy shield against Ireland's merciless winters. And tomorrow night, when frost rattles the roof again, you'll thank the sheep, thank the grease, and wrap yourself once more in the itchy embrace of survival. Winter in Ireland wasn't just cold. It was hungry. The harshest weeks of the year weren't measured by frost on the ground or wind howling through the thatch, but by the emptiness of the pantry. People called it the hungry months, a grim season when stored food dwindled and every meal was a calculation. You wake one morning in January and open the family's store pit, just a shallow hole lined with straw and covered with boards. Inside, the supplies look thin. A few turnips, some wrinkled carrots, onions sprouting pale green shoots in the dark. The cheese wheel has already shrunk to a hard rind. The oat sack, once bulging after harvest, hangs slack. Every handful you scoop now has to last twice as long. Your stomach growls, and you realize the frost outside isn't the worst enemy. Hunger is. The medieval Irish diet was heavy on oats, dairy, and root vegetables. In summer, fields yielded barley and rye. In autumn, hazelnuts and berries padded the diet. But by deep winter, the land stopped giving. What you had stored was all you had. The poor, stretched oat porridge thin, turning it into watery gruel. Families cut hard bread into smaller pieces, soaking it in broth to trick their bellies. Every bite was ration, measured against the number of mouths in the hut. Historians still argue whether peasants planned their storage perfectly, or whether most families simply hoped and prayed the sacks would last until spring. And it wasn't just lack of food, it was lack of variety. Imagine eating porridge every day for weeks. Breakfast oats boiled in water. Dinner oats boiled in milk if you have it. Supper oats reheated with whatever scraps of turnip survived. A joke in the making, except no one was laughing. Malnutrition set in immune systems weakened and colds hit harder. The hungry months weren't just dull, they were dangerous. Cheese and butter offered brief relief. Dairy was central to Irish survival, with cattle prized not only for meat, but for the steady flow of milk. In winter, milk yields dropped, and butter became scarce. Some households mixed animal fats with herbs to stretch supplies. There are records of people eating sour milk curds in desperate months, an acquired taste to put it politely. But even sour curds were better than nothing. The quirky side of hunger was ingenuity. Families scoured the land for supplements. Nettles boiled into soup, seaweed dried and chewed along the coast, acorns ground into bitter flour. Folklore remembers people digging up rush roots, roasting them until edible, or chewing on bark to trick the stomach. Scholars still argue whether these were routine practices or only famine measures, but they show how resourceful people became when cupboards ran bare. And famine loomed constantly. A bad harvest meant not just lean months, but deadly ones. Medieval Ireland suffered periodic food shortages, with chronicles describing years when whole villages weakened, children shrank, and wandering beggars filled the roads. Scarcity winters, they were called, when even nobles fretted and peasants counted days. In those months, survival wasn't guaranteed. People cut rations to nearly nothing, trading strength today for a chance at tomorrow. A modern aside, imagine your fridge on a bad week. No takeout, no stores open, just half a bag of oats and a wilting cabbage. Now stretch that over 3 months and add the knowledge that failure means not inconvenience, but death. That was the medieval Irish pantry in February. Social ties mattered more than ever in hunger season. Families swapped or bartered scraps, a pot of oats for a hunk of smoked fish, a wedge of cheese for a handful of beans. Neighbors who shared survived longer. Neighbors who hoarded earned reputations that lasted for generations. Folklore remembers stingy households as villains, their names muttered even centuries later. Hunger tested not just bodies, but communities. The hunger months also bred superstition. People whispered charms to stretch food, sprinkled holy water on sacks of oats, or placed blessed herbs above the pantry door. Some prayed to Bridget Saint and goddess intertwined, asking her to protect the churns and milk cows. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were pagan remnants or Christian improvisations, but to the people living them, the line didn't matter. When hunger gnawed, any hope was worth clinging to, and yet not every story is grim. Winter hunger also brought moments of intimacy. Families gathered around the hearth bowls of thin pottage in hand and shared stories to distract from empty stomachs. Hunger turned meals into rituals of togetherness. A mother breaking bread carefully into equal pieces, a father pouring the last of the ale into mugs so everyone had a sip, children licking spoons clean. The memory of eating together sometimes outweighed the taste itself. Still, the worst weeks stretched on. Bellies ached, children cried in the night, and dreams filled with visions of food apples, roasted meat, honey cakes that weren't coming. The hungry months were survival, stripped bare, no feasts, no abundance, just enough to make it to the thaw. When March arrived, green shoots pierced the frost, and hope returned with them. Wild garlic nettles and early greens appeared, and bellies filled a little more easily. But the scars of hunger lingered. Bodies thinner, cheeks hollow, strength sapped. Every spring, feast carried an undertone of relief you had made it through another winter. The hungry months taught lessons that stayed. Save more next harvest. Stretch oats thinner. Share with neighbors, because next year it might be you knocking on their door. Survival in medieval Ireland wasn't a matter of feasting. It was a matter of enduring the hunger together. Thirst is one thing you can't ignore, even in the middle of winter. You'd think water so plentiful in Ireland with its endless streams and rain would be the natural choice. But here's the medieval twist. Water could kill you faster than the cold. Parasites, bacteria, and the occasional decomposing animal turned rivers into roulette wheels. And so when you reached for a drink in medieval Ireland, odds were high it wasn't water in your cup. It was ale. Ale, not wine, was rare, expensive, imported from France or Spain for nobles and monasteries. For peasants, ale was the drink of life. Brewed from oats or barley, it was weak in alcohol, but strong in reliability. Brewing meant boiling the liquid, and boiling meant killing off most of what lurked invisibly in streams. In a world without microscopes, people didn't know germs existed, but they knew one thing: the family that drank ale lived longer than the one that gulped down raw river water. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish households brewed daily or weekly, but the consensus is clear. Ale was the safest bet on the table. Picture this dawn in January, the fire barely revived, and the family bowls of porridge steaming. Beside them, not water but small mugs of cloudy ale poured from a clay jug. Children drink it too, their tiny hands gripping mugs while parents pretend not to notice. Don't imagine tipsy toddlers stumbling around. This was small ale with barely enough alcohol to notice. Its purpose wasn't intoxication, it was survival. A mug of ale warmed the belly, filled the gaps left by thin porridge, and kept parasites at bay. And ale wasn't just drink. It was food. Grain-based, thick, and often cloudy, it carried calories peasants desperately needed in the hunger months. Some brews were closer to liquid bread than modern beer, nourishing enough to count as a meal. Farmers carried it to fields in leather flasks, drinking between tasks, hydrating and feeding themselves in one gulp. A modern aside, imagine a protein shake that smells like porridge left in a warm cupboard too long. That's medieval ale, nutritious, questionable, and oddly essential. Of course, brewing wasn't glamorous. Peasant households used whatever grain they had: oats, rye, barley. They malted, mashed, and boiled it, straining it roughly through straw or cloth. No hops, the bitter herb that flavors modern beer, entered Irish brewing until much later. Instead, they flavored ale with herbs like bog myrtle yarrow or heather, each adding both taste and dubious medicinal claims. Was it tasty? Probably not. But when you're thirsty and survival is at stake, tolerable becomes the new delicious. Ale making was often women's work. Mothers, wives, and daughters brewed in clay pots or wooden tubs, their recipes passed down through generations. Some added honey if they could afford it, others spiced with herbs gathered from hedgerows. A good brewer became respected in her village, her ale in demand at gatherings and markets. Brewing wasn't just household necessity, it was social currency, just like fire. Historians still argue whether women dominated the trade entirely, but records of alewives in Irish villages suggest they were vital keepers of thirst and community. Ale also shaped gatherings. Even in the bleakest hunger months, a shared jug of ale could turn silence into conversation. Neighbors stopped by, offered help, or swapped gossip over a clay cup. Weddings, wakes, and fairs all demanded more ale than food. If supplies ran thin, communities pooled what they had. Brewing weak, but abundant batches. To drink together was to survive together. Of course, not all ale was weak. Some households flush with grain, after a good harvest, brewed stronger batches, warming, intoxicating, and dangerous in large amounts. Monasteries, with their wealth and resources, perfected the craft, producing ales rich in flavor and alcohol. Pilgrims and travelers often sought monasteries not just for prayer, but for a decent drink. And nobles, they drank imported wine when they could, but ale still filled their tables. Ireland's climate made grain abundant. Grapes, not so much. Drinking ale daily shaped people's lives in unexpected ways. Toothaches were numbed, coughs eased, and for a short while, hunger dulled. Some even believed ale held protective powers that herbs brewed into it could chase away illness. Scholars still debate how much truth lay in these beliefs, but when the alternative was deadly, water ale did seem almost miraculous. And yet ale had its critics. Medieval moralists grumbled about drunkenness, about men stumbling through villages, or women brewing more than their households needed. Court records from Irish towns include fines for disorder caused by too much ale. The paradox was obvious. Ale saved lives, but too much of it wrecked them. Still, in winter's cold, with food scarce and water unsafe, ale was always poured. A quirky tidbit, clay-drinking mugs often had handles thick enough to double as knuckle guards. If arguments over ale turned physical, as they sometimes did, your cup became both weapon and shield. Folk tales even warn about the dangers of bad ale, blaming sour batches for sickness or misfortune. Whether it was contamination, poor storage, or superstition, no one forgot a winter spoiled by a bad brew. A modern comparison. Think of coffee in a modern household. Not strictly necessary, but try taking it away and watch panic unfold. Medieval Irish ale was even more vital. The morning ritual, the daily safety net, the shared comfort. Without it, life became sharper, harsher, and infinitely riskier. So tonight, as frost creeps along the roof and your belly grumbles from meager porridge, you lift a mug of cloudy ale. It's not refreshing, not crisp, not even particularly good, but it won't kill you. And in medieval Ireland, that was reason enough to drink deeply, pass the jug, and whisper a quiet thanks to the humble brew that kept you alive. Hunger months demand creativity, and in medieval Ireland, that often meant turning to the rivers, lakes, and coasts. Fish were everywhere, slippery gifts from streams and sea, but they spoiled quickly. Without salt and smoke, they were useless by the second day. With salt and smoke, they became winter's lifeline, hard, chewy, pungent, but dependable. Salted fish and smoked eel, not exactly delicacies, but survival disguised as food. Picture the process. Along Ireland's coast, fishermen haul in cod herring or mackerel. Inland villagers set eel traps in rivers, their wicker baskets baited with scraps. Eels, abundant in Irish waters, slithered into traps by the dozens. Fresh, they were fatty, oily, and slippery enough to make preparation a nightmare. But smoked or salted, they turned into dense protein-rich food that lasted months. Families ate them reluctantly at first, then gratefully when nothing else remained. Historians still argue whether fish were considered peasant food or a respected staple, but archaeological digs prove one thing: fish bones litter winter settlements. Salt was the key. Precious, expensive, and sometimes imported, it preserved fish by drawing out moisture and deterring rot. Nobles could afford barrels of it. Peasants scraped by with smaller amounts. Coastal communities fared better, collecting sea salt from evaporated pools. Inland villages traded butter or wool for a pinch of white crystals, then guarded it like treasure. To waste salt was a sin. It meant letting rot win. Smoked fish was more democratic. Villagers built small smoke huts, hung eels or trout over smoldering fires, and let them dry for days. The smoke curled into the flesh, sealing it against decay, turning pale fish into brown, leathery strips. The taste, strong, earthy, and relentless. Your breath carried it for days. A modern aside, imagine jerky, but wetter, oilier, and with the faint tang of a campfire, you can't escape. That was smoked eel. Yet these foods weren't just about survival, they carried cultural weight. Fast days dictated by the church forbade meat, but allowed fish. Monks cultivated fisheries, filling monastic cellars with barrels of salted herring. Nobles boasted ponds stocked with eels, a luxury disguised as piety. Peasants followed suit in their own way, fishing rivers and smoking catches not for status, but necessity. When Lent or Advent rolled around, everyone ate fish whether they wanted to or not. Religion demanded it, hunger encouraged it, and preservation made it possible. Folklore reveals a quirky relationship with eels. Slippery snake-like, they unsettled people even as they sustained them. Tales warned children not to eat too many, lest they become sluggish, like the eels themselves. Others described eels as shapeshifters, slipping between human and animal form. Scholars still debate whether these tales reflected unease with the animal or simple exaggeration of their abundance. Either way, eels wriggled through both diet and imagination. The smell of smoked eel filled huts through winter. Thick, greasy smoke coated rafters, mingling with peat fumes. Children gnawed on strips, chewing for minutes before managing to swallow. Adults boiled chunks into stews, softening the leathery flesh with oats or cabbage. Meals weren't gourmet, they were practical. Every bite filled bellies, added protein, and kept weakness at bay. Salted fish traveled further. Packed in barrels, traded inland, it became currency as well as sustenance. Monks at Clonmacnoise or Glendalough used salted fish to feed pilgrims. Fishermen traded it at fairs, exchanging barrels for wool butter or tools. In a land where famine always loomed, fish preserved with salt or smoke turned into edible insurance policies. Still, monotony set in. Imagine eating smoked eel day after day. Your tongue aches for freshness. Your stomach rebels at the grease, But hunger leaves no room for complaints. Some families tried to vary it, grinding dried fish into powder to sprinkle over pottage, or mixing eel with herbs to disguise the taste. Did it help? Maybe. But by February, no one wanted to see another strip of eel again. Yet when the snows melted, those who had fish left survived. Those who didn't. A modern comparison, think of canned tuna. Opened gratefully in lean times, ignored when better options exist. Multiply that by months, add the constant smoke of peat, and you have medieval Ireland's relationship with preserved fish. Religious calendars made fish even more essential. Between Lent Advent and numerous saints' days, medieval Christians spent nearly half the year abstaining from meat. For nobles, that meant variety imported salmon fancy sauces. For peasants, it meant the same smoked eel, reheated again and again. Ironically, fasting rules aligned with necessity peasants often couldn't afford meat anyway. Church law turned poverty into piety, and smoked eel became both religious compliance and reluctant salvation. There's another quirky tidbit. Some chronicles describe salted fish as so hard it could break teeth if not soaked first. Families sometimes left it overnight in buckets, letting water soften it back into chewable form. In the morning, they boiled it with oats, turning it into a kind of fishy porridge that filled the belly, if not the heart. Historians still argue whether these recipes were nourishing or simply desperate, but bones and waste pits suggest people kept chewing no matter what. When spring finally came, fresh greens and new milk pushed salted fish aside. But for months, it was the silent partner in every meal, the background note of winter life. The smell of smoke in your clothes, the tang of salt on your tongue, the grease of eel on your fingers. It all marked the season of survival. So tonight, as frost clings to the roof and hunger hums in your stomach, you bite into a strip of smoked eel. It's chewy, oily, overwhelming, but it keeps you alive. And in medieval Ireland, that was enough. When the salted fish barrels run low and smoked eel begins to taste like punishment, families turn their hopes to the ground literally. Roots hidden in pits beneath floors or buried outside under layers of straw become lifelines through the worst stretch of winter. These cellars weren't the stone-lined wine vaults of nobles. They were crude, damp holes in the earth, half storage, half gamble, and they kept peasants alive one turnip at a time. You imagine crouching inside your hut, lifting a rough plank in the floor. Beneath it lies a shallow cavity lined with straw and rushes. The air is cold, earthy, and faintly sour from months of damp vegetables. Your hands grope in the dark until they close around something solid, a turnip, shriveled but edible. You pull it free like treasure. It's not gold, but tonight it feels like wealth. Root crops were staples because they could be hidden from frost. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions all stored well underground. Families buried them in pits covering with straw leaves or even dung to keep out the cold. The trick was to balance moisture, too dry, and the roots shriveled, too wet, and they rotted. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish peasants mastered this balance or simply accepted the yearly loss of half their stores. Either way, every surviving root in February was a victory. The sight of these roots was never glamorous. Carrots sprouted pale shoots, onions grew long, white tails, turnips wrinkled like fists. But hunger ignored appearances. Families boiled them into pottage, grated them into oat cakes, or chewed them raw if desperation struck. Flavor ranged from bland to bitter, but every bite dulled the ache in your stomach. A quirky tidbit, some pits doubled as hiding spots not just for food, but for valuables. Archaeologists have found hoards of coins and tools buried alongside vegetables, evidence that peasants saw the earth as both pantry and bank. Imagine digging for a parsnip and finding your neighbor's hidden silver awkward dinner conversation guaranteed. The labor of root storage began months earlier. After harvest, families sorted piles, best roots for winter, smallest for immediate eating, worst for animal fodder. Children were tasked with packing straw around vegetables, pressing them into pits, and sealing the tops with clay or sod. The smell lingered in huts, a constant earthy perfume, half comforting, half cloying. If you could still smell onions in January, you knew you'd survive another week. Yet roots came with dangers. Mice and rats tunneled into pits, gnawing through straw and stealing food. Families checked stores, constantly chasing vermin out with sticks, plugging holes, sometimes setting crude traps. Nothing broke morale like finding half your turnips gnawed away by a rat fattened on your winter savings. Folklore even blames mischievous fairies for stealing food from storage pits, though peasants knew the real culprits had whiskers and tails. Inside huts, some families built raised platforms for roots, lifting them off damp ground. Others buried pits just outside, though snow and frost made digging treacherous. A desperate February morning might see you hacking at frozen earth, with numb hands just to pry loose a carrot. A modern aside, imagine breaking into your own freezer with a pickaxe, except the freezer leaks smells and occasionally houses a family of mice. Roots weren't just food, they were strategy. Families rationed, carefully saving heartier vegetables for later. Turnips lasted longest. Onions added flavor to otherwise bland meals, and carrots offered sweetness rare in winter diets. Some pits even stored cabbages layered like green bundles beneath straw. By the time you hauled them out, they were limp sour and reeking, but still edible. And edible meant life. The church calendar again played its part. During fast days when meat was forbidden, roots became central. Soups of turnip and onion sustained peasants through Lent, their blandness almost a virtue. Nobles feasted on fish, but peasants scraped bowls of root pottage, chewing thoughtfully and pretending to feel holy. Hunger and piety blurred easily in the hungry months. Scholars still debate whether potatoes existed in Ireland before the late 16th century. They didn't, though myths claim otherwise. Instead, medieval Irish survival rested on humbler crops. The potato's eventual arrival would revolutionize diets, but for centuries before turnips and carrots bore the burden. Their presence beneath your floor was the difference between complaint and collapse. There's a rhythm to these meals. Wake up, pull a root from storage, boil it into thin stew. With oats, eat slowly. Supper, repeat. Children complain. Adults hush them, and everyone eats anyway. By February, taste buds grow numb. Roots aren't exciting, but they fill space where hunger gnaws. Still, monotony breeds creativity. Some families fermented roots, turning them into sour preserves. Others mashed them with herbs or fried thin slices on hot stones. Were these tasty? Perhaps not, but they broke routine. Even a slightly different texture could trick the tongue into gratitude. Roots carried stories too. Folk sayings reminded families not to dig too early, lest stores run out before spring. Legends told of saints multiplying turnips to feed villages, miracles retold around smoky fires. The roots weren't glamorous, but they inspired reverence. They were winter's currency, and every wrinkled carrot was a promise of one more day alive. When spring finally returned, the last roots emerged soft sprouting and half rotted. Families ate them anyway, gagging slightly, laughing grimly, because in the end, it wasn't about taste or beauty. It was about endurance. Beneath your floor in the damp earth winter had hidden your salvation, and you had survived to dig it out. If the hearth is the heart of the house, fuel is its blood. And in medieval Ireland, fuel didn't come from endless forests. By the early Middle Ages, much of the island's woodland had already been cut for building farming or ship timber. What remained wasn't nearly enough to keep every family warm through the endless winters, so people turned to something strange, dirty, and surprisingly effective peat. Peat is born in bogs, vast, soggy landscapes, where moss and plant matter decompose slowly underwater. Instead of rotting into nothing, the plants compress into a dense, blackish-brown material that can be cut, dried, and burned. Today, we call it turf in Ireland. Back then, it was life itself. Without peat huts froze. With peat families at least had smoky warmth curling from their hearths. You imagine trudging into a bog in late summer when the ground is half solid, half treacherous sponge. Men and women wield long-handled spades shaped like knives, cutting neat blocks of peat from the earth. Each slice squelches out wet and heavy as if you're pulling bricks of mud from the underworld. Children stack the blocks into low walls, leaving them to dry under whatever weak sun the Irish sky allows. Weeks later, the heavy wet lumps shrink into lighter crumbly bricks, fuel ready to burn. The work is exhausting. Bog water seeps into your boots, clings to your legs, chills your bones. Hands blister from cutting, backs ache from hauling. But families endure it because each brick of turf means another night by the fire. Historians still argue whether peasants cut enough peat to last the whole winter or whether shortages were common. The archaeological record suggests many huts smelled of turf smoke year-round. Peat burns differently than wood. It smolders slower and cooler, producing thick, earthy smoke that stains everything it touches. Rafters' blackened cloaks absorb the odor, and your skin feels coated in soot. Visitors to medieval huts probably noticed the smell long before they saw the smoke. Yet that same slow smolder kept embers alive through the night, perfect for banking coals until morning. Wood roared and vanished quickly. Peat lingered stubborn as the people who cut it. The bogs themselves carried a mix of dread and reverence. They were liminal spaces, wet, dangerous, unpredictable. Stories circulated of travelers swallowed whole, their bodies never recovered. Even today, archaeologists uncover bog bodies, human remains preserved for centuries in the peat, their skin intact, their faces eerily recognizable. Scholars still debate whether these were ritual sacrifices or unfortunate victims of accidents, but medieval villagers likely told simpler stories. The bog keeps what it takes. And yet, people kept going back, not just for peat, but for berries, herbs, and reeds. The bog was both threat and pantry, a place of fear and necessity. Cutting turf felt like bargaining with the earth. Take what you need. Leave the rest, hope the bog doesn't swallow you for greed. A quirky tidbit peat wasn't only fuel. Some families used dried moss from bogs as insulation, stuffing it into cracks in walls. Others used bog water, medicinally convinced its dark, tannin-rich pools healed wounds. Whether effective or not, the belief shows how deeply bogs wove into survival. Even livestock benefited. Bog hay cut from edges of wetlands fed cattle when other fodder ran low. Imagine winter nights by a peat fire. The room fills with dense smoke, your eyes water. Your cloak stinks, but your fingers finally thaw. children cough, but they curl closer because smoke and warmth still beat frost in silence. Overhead, smoke drifts into the thatch, fumigating fleas. The roof drips tar-black soot. You breathe it all in, and part of you wonders how many winters your lungs can endure. But the alternative, freezing in silence, isn't an option. Peat also defined communities. Families without bog access traded desperately with those who had it. In some regions, disputes erupted over cutting rights because turf wasn't infinite. Even today, echoes of those medieval turf wars remain in land records. Scholars note that early Irish law codes, the Brehon laws, referenced turf cutting as a regulated activity, proof of how essential it was. A modern aside, imagine if heating oil or gas suddenly came only from swamps. You had to dig yourself. Cold winters would look very different. For medieval Irish peasants, the bog was their fuel station, their hardware store, and sometimes their graveyard. Religion crept into peat too. Fires fueled by turf often burned during feast days, their smoke curling skyward as offerings. Ashes were sometimes spread in fields to fertilize poor soil. Priests grumbled about smoke-choking chapels, but turf was too common to ban. Faith had to make peace with fuel. By February, stacks of dried turf dwindled. Families rationed carefully, burning small pieces and saving larger bricks for storms. On desperate nights, people scavenged the edges of bogs for any scrap left behind, even half-rotted chunks. Children carried them home in baskets, proud of each smoky brick. The house filled with the smell of damp turf, but pride overcame disgust. Every ember meant survival. When spring arrived, huts stank of months of smoke. Clothes, walls, and lungs all bore peat's signature. But families were alive, and they owed it to the bogs, to the endless labor of cutting, stacking, drying, hauling. Without peat, medieval Ireland would have frozen silent centuries ago. So you pull your cloak, tighter cough, into the smoke, and watch the embers glow. Peat doesn't make life pleasant. It makes life possible. And in winter's grip, that's all anyone asks. Clothing in medieval Ireland wasn't fashion, it was armor. Not against swords or spears, but against the cold that seeped through walls, floors, and bones. Wool, linen, and layers were the true weapons of survival. Every thread mattered, every scrap of cloth repurposed, and every patch stitched with more hope than style. You start the day already wrapped in everything you own. First comes the linen shift, thin, scratchy, and rarely washed. Linen is breathable in summer, but in winter it's icy against the skin. Still, it's essential. Without linen, wool rubs raw against you. And linen, however thin, gives a small buffer between flesh and the constant scratch of lanolin-rich wool. Historians still argue whether peasants had more than one set of linen. But odds are grim. One shirt patched until it resembled a quilt, worn until it dissolved. Over that wool. Lots of wool. Tunics thick and coarse, dyed dull browns or grays. Cloaks heavy with grease, as we've seen. Leggings sagging at the knees, tied with cords because belts are scarce. On your feet, layers of cloth wrapped around toes and ankles stuffed into wooden clogs or rawhide shoes. Socks, as we know them, barely exist. You improvise insulation with rags, moss, or straw. The result? Feet that are warm for about 10 minutes, then wet forever. Layering wasn't just habit. It was science, though. No one used the word. Each layer trapped air, slowing the cold's advance. Families wore everything at once, tunic over tunic, cloak over cloak, hat pulled low, scarf tied high. Laundry wasn't an option in deep winter. Water froze, streams iced, and drying clothes indoors left them stiff with smoke. Better to stink and stay warm than to freeze while waiting for your one tunic to dry. A quirky tidbit grime helped. Layers of dirt and grease and cloth acted like insulation. Medieval people didn't wash often, not out of laziness, but out of strategy. Soap was rare, water dangerous, and cleanliness secondary to warmth. So your cloak smelled like a barn. Congratulations, it also trapped more heat. Modern scientists would call it disgusting. Medieval families called it survival. Accessories mattered too. Hats and hoods were prized since heat poured from uncovered heads. Simple woolen caps were treasures patched carefully and guarded fiercely. Gloves made of leather scraps or knitted wool kept hands from splitting in the cold. Scarves were lengths of cloth, sometimes nothing more than strips torn from old tunics, but they shielded throats from icy winds. Every piece of fabric found a use. Nothing was wasted, and still people froze. The cold laughed at layers. On stormy nights, wool grew heavy with damp. Cloaks stiffened with frost linen clung to sweat, and rags on feet turned into icy bricks. You shifted constantly to keep blood moving, knowing that stillness invited numbness, and numbness meant danger. Scholars still debate how common frostbite was in medieval Ireland, but accounts of lost fingers and toes suggest it was far from rare. Yet clothing also carried meaning. Laws distinguished who could wear what. Nobles flaunted fine linen imported from abroad, bright dyes from woad or madder cloaks lined with fur. Peasants stayed in browns, grays, and sheep's wool white unless they dyed homespun with local plants. Still, even poor villagers sometimes added touches of color stripes, woven into belts, embroidery stitched crudely but proudly on tunics. Warmth, first beauty, second, but beauty still crept in. Because even in hunger and frost humans crave color. Imagine family life inside the hut. Everyone wrapped in layers, heads, swaddled faces, half hidden. Children tripping over oversized tunics, cut down from parents. Elders wrapped in so many cloaks, they look like walking bundles of wool. The hut is smoky cramped, and everyone smells of lanolin and peat. But beneath those layers beats resilience. Each piece of fabric is proof of hands spinning, weaving, mending, and refusing to yield to winter. Laundry, when attempted, was comedy. You trudge to a half-frozen stream, smash ice-soak your tunic and scrub with lye made from ash. Then you drag the dripping garment home and drape it near the hearth. Days later, it's still damp, reeking of smoke. Wear it anyway. What choice do you have? Children complained, but mothers knew clean didn't matter. Warm did. There's also the question of shoes. Ireland's winters were wet, not just cold. Mud froze into ruts, snow melted into bog water, and bare ground seeped chill upward. Shoes made of rawhide barely lasted a season. Wooden clogs helped but offered little warmth. Some families stuffed shoes with straw, changing it nightly like disposable socks. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants truly went barefoot in winter or simply wore rags so flimsy they might as well have. Either way, feet suffered. A modern aside, picture yourself on a freezing day, every item of clothing you own layered onto your body. The result isn't sleek. You're bulky, itchy, and smell faintly of wet sheep. But it works. That's medieval layering. Ugly, uncomfortable, and utterly effective. Clothing was also inheritance. A father's cloak became a son's. A mother's tunic cut down to fit a daughter. Families stitched, patched, and reshaped until garments bore no resemblance to their original form. Archaeologists find fragments of medieval fabric patched so many times they resemble mosaics of wool. Each patch is a story, a rip repaired after a storm, a hole mended after sparks from the hearth. Nothing was disposable. Everything lived until it fell apart. And then there were blankets, or rather, the lack of them. Instead of soft quilts, families used cloaks, spare tunics, or animal skins. Beds stuffed with straw scratched and shifted so clothing doubled as bedding. Children fell asleep, wrapped in their parents' cloaks. Adults shared coverings, layering cloth and skin against the night. The line between garment and blanket blurred completely. By dawn, layers reek of sweat smoke and damp. You peel them off reluctantly, only to put them back on minutes later. There is no wardrobe rotation, no winter fashion. There is only survival. Wool linen and layers ugly, itchy essential make the difference between another day alive and another body lost to frost. So you wrap yourself tighter, ignore the itch, and step into the cold. The clothes won't make you comfortable, but they'll keep you moving. And moving in medieval Ireland is the only way to see spring. The sun slips early behind the hills, and in medieval Ireland that means darkness doesn't creep. It falls sudden and heavy. No lamplight, no street torches, no glow from neighboring houses. Just night vast and absolute, broken only by the flicker of the hearth. And before that, darkness swallows everything. Families turn to ritual. Prayers before the dark were as essential as cloaks and coals. They didn't just soothe the soul. They gave structure to fear. You sit near the fire, smoke curling into your eyes, and listen. The hut quiets after chores. Tools are put away, livestock shuffled to corners, children hushed. Then voices rise, soft, rhythmic, weaving through the smoky air. Simple prayers memorize chants, psalms in Latin half understood, or invocations to Brigid saint and goddess intertwined. The words carry warmth no cloak can give. Faith in these moments isn't distant theology. It's survival insurance. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Frost kills the weak, hunger gnaws at the strong, illness stalks in the dark. So you speak the words again louder, pleading with saints to protect the hearth with Christ, to guard the animals, with Brigid to bless the churns and cows. Scholars still argue whether these prayers were truly Christian or remnants of older pagan rites rebranded with saints' names. But in the hut, the labels don't matter. Hope matters. There's a rhythm to these evenings. Parents lead children mimic. A candle, if one survives, is lit before a crude wooden cross or holy image. If not, the fire alone serves as altar. Some sprinkle holy water on the doorway, tracing a cross to ward off spirits. Others toss herbs into the flames, whispers rising with smoke. Did it work? Belief said yes, and belief in winter was as real as fire. Superstition threaded through every prayer. Some families laid breadcrumbs on the table for wandering souls. Others left milk outside for the good folk. The fairies no one dared anger. Pray too loudly, and you might draw their attention. Pray too softly, and the saints might not hear. The balance, like banking coals, was delicate. Children often dozed during prayers, their heads resting on parents' shoulders. But elders stayed awake, repeating words learned decades earlier, their voices steady against the storm outside. Oral tradition was the true scripture. Here prayers passed mouth to mouth, never written, but remembered in every hungry season. Archaeologists can't unearth these moments, but folklore carries echoes, rhymes muttered before bed, charms whispered against frost. A quirky tidbit: some households recited charms specifically for their cattle. Keep the milk flowing, keep the cow warm, keep the wolf away. Scholars debate, whether this was faith or farming pragmatism disguised as devotion. Either way, it shows what mattered. Survival wasn't just human, it was communal beast and man alike. Imagine the feeling. The hut, smoky, damp, and cold. The family pressed close, murmuring prayers while frost hammers the roof. Beyond the walls lies only silence and darkness. No moon tonight, no stars through clouds, just blackness. Without ritual, fear would swallow you whole. With prayer, the dark becomes bearable. Sometimes prayers turned into storytelling. Elders shifted seamlessly from psalms to tales of saints who lit fires with a glance, or heroes who braved winters worse than this. Saint Bridget, spreading her cloak to cover Ireland. Saint Patrick, banishing not only snakes, but hunger. Myths woven into prayers. Prayers woven into myths. Children drifted to sleep, soothed by the idea that holy figures had faced the same cold and survived. And when sickness struck, prayers doubled. Families knelt by the hearth, begging saints for healing. A child coughing in the dark became the center of whispered chants. Herbs might be brewed charms tied around the neck, but always the words accompanied them. Healing wasn't just plants. It was petitions to forces greater than frost. A modern aside, think of turning off the lights during a storm gathering with family and whispering hopes that the power will come back. Multiply the fear tenfold. Remove the guarantee of electricity and make your only defense words. That's prayers before the dark. Scholars still argue whether medieval Irish peasants feared the dark itself or what it symbolized death-hunger spirits. But the practice of nightly prayers shows how deeply they needed structure. Darkness wasn't just absence of light. It was chaos pressing against the door. Prayer gave shape, gave order, gave defiance. When the last words faded, silence returned. Families banked the fire. One last time, pulled cloaks tight, and lay together in layers. The prayers hung in the smoky air, unseen shields against the night. Did they guarantee survival? Maybe not. But without them, despair might have finished what frost began. So you murmur the words, cross yourself, and close your eyes. Outside, the dark presses harder. Inside the hut hums with faith. And tonight, at least you let yourself believe that the prayers are strong enough to carry you until dawn. Once the prayers faded and the hut settled into its smoky rhythm, another tradition stirred stories. Legends around the fire weren't just entertainment. They were survival for the mind. When your stomach growled and frost tapped on the roof, tales of heroes and fairies gave warmth. Words couldn't. You sit cross-legged on the straw firelight, flickering across faces half hidden by cloaks. The old man in the corner clears his throat. Children lean closer, and the night begins to soften. His voice rises steady but cracked, weaving myths older than the hut itself. Stories of Cu Chulainn, the boy hero, who fought armies with only his rage and spear. Stories of Finn McCool and the Fianna warriors who roamed Ireland's forests, stronger than hunger, cleverer than frost. Their exploits crackle louder than the fire filling the smoky hut with something greater than fear imagination. Legends carried more than amusement, they carried lessons. Heroes endured winters harsher than yours. Saints multiplied loaves when famine struck. Even fairies, mischievous and terrifying, reflected the cold's unpredictability. Folklore scholars still argue whether these tales were meant primarily to entertain or to encode survival strategies. Likely both. Wrapped in myth were warnings: don't wander into bogs at night, don't disrespect the hearth, don't eat food left on a doorstep, because you never knew if it belonged to the good folk. Children's eyes widened as stories blurred the line between real and myth. A mother might describe Bridget spreading her cloak across Ireland, bringing warmth where frost reigned. Was it history, faith, or wishful thinking? To the children, it was enough to imagine a cloak big enough to smother winter itself. And then came the darker stories, whispered when the fire burned low. Tales of banshees wailing outside huts, omens of death carried on the wind, of changelings swapped by fairies when infants grew sickly, of ghostly riders galloping through storms. These stories frightened children into silence, but they also explained the inexplicable sudden deaths, failing crops, illnesses no herb could cure. Fear wrapped in narrative felt easier than fear without shape. The hut itself became a theater. Flames threw shadows onto the mud walls, turning storytellers into giants, turning children into miniature warriors fighting invisible foes. Laughter erupted when someone imitated a foolish king, or when goats bleated at perfectly timed moments, as if joining the tale. The line between reality and legend blurred in the smoke. A quirky tidbit: scholars studying medieval Irish manuscripts note how oral tales eventually found their way onto vellum, written by monks who half condemned and half preserved them. The Fianna cycle, the Ulster cycle, legends that peasants whispered around fires, became literature centuries later. But in huts, they were never literature. They were life told nightly, shaped by whoever remembered best. Stories also filled the long gap between supper and sleep. With no clocks, no diversions, time stretched. Talking kept fear at bay, kept children from noticing the gnaw of hunger. One tale led to another, one hero to one saint, one fairy trickster to one neighbor's gossip disguised as myth. Oral tradition thrived because silence was unbearable. A modern aside, think of binge watching a TV series during a blackout, except the series lives entirely in your grandmother's memory. No electricity, no screens, just voices and imagination. That was medieval Netflix stories by the fire. Legends gave identity too. In telling of heroes, families connected themselves to something larger. Even if your hut leaked and your belly was empty, you could still claim kinship with Cuchulain's courage or Bridget's blessings. Stories shrank the cold, making it a backdrop to endurance rather than the whole stage. Sometimes, stories slipped into song. Chants about winter battles, poems praising warriors, lullabies for restless children. The Irish oral tradition blended seamlessly. Prayer story and song interwoven until no one knew where one ended and the other began. The hut glowed not only with flame, but with words, a warmth more lasting than smoke. And when fatigue set in, voices softened. Children fell asleep, mid-tail their heads on straw, their dreams filled with fairy lights and warrior feats. Parents whispered the endings anyway, believing the words would seep into their children's sleep like charms. Even elders, worn from years of cold, found comfort in repeating stories they had once heard as children themselves. Legends didn't stop the frost. They didn't fill bellies or patch leaking roofs. But they gave families reason to endure. To laugh at absurd kings, to fear banshees instead of famine, to imagine warmth greater than fire. And sometimes that was enough to make the night survivable. So, tonight as frost gnaws at the walls and smoke drifts heavy, you listen. The tale of Finn McCool stretches on his strength, larger than life, his wit sharper than hunger. For a moment, you forget your aching stomach, the icy drafts, the fleas, and the straw. You remember only that you belong to a people whose stories outlasted winters. and you close your eyes, drifting into dreams, warmed by fire words and legends too stubborn to freeze. Winter in medieval Ireland wasn't a solo battle. No matter how carefully you banked your fire, salted your fish, or buried your roots, one family alone could not outlast the cold forever. Survival was communal, stitched together by obligation barter and the stubborn kindness of neighbors. In winter, the hut next door was as important as your own hearth. You imagine waking one bleak February morning, frost clinging to the rafters, your food pit nearly empty. The last turnip is shriveled, the oat sack holds only dust. Hunger gnaws at your belly. You glance at your children, their faces thin, and you know what comes next. You cross the muddy track to your neighbor's hut and knock. Inside, the story repeats in reverse. Some nights, it was you giving, other nights you receiving. Barter kept the community alive. A hunk of smoked eel swapped for a scoop of oats. A cloak patched in exchange for dried herbs. Butter traded for turf bricks. Nothing was free, but generosity lingered, an understanding that debts of food weren't measured in coins, but in survival. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish villages leaned more on barter or on kinship obligation. The truth is probably both. Families shared because tomorrow they might be the ones in need. Neighbors also pooled labor. Gathering peat, repairing roofs, or mending walls were easier when hands multiplied. One family alone might freeze under a leaking thatch. 10 neighbors together could patch it before the storm worsened. You can picture villagers standing shoulder to shoulder in the windstraw and mud smeared across their arms, laughing grimly as they work. Cold bites less when shared. And then there was the fire. If your hearth went cold overnight, the quickest salvation was next door. People carried glowing coals in iron pots wrapped in cloth or ash, hurrying home before the ember died. Borrowing fire became a phrase for both necessity and trust. A neighbor who refused you wasn't just stingy, they were cruel, risking lives for pride. Folklore remembers generous households long after names fade, their reputations glowing like the coals they once shared. Communal meals appeared too, especially in famine years. Families cooked large pots of watery pottage, everyone adding what scraps they had. One brought turnips, another a carrot, another a strip of smoked fish. Together, it became enough. The taste was never fine, but the gesture fed more than bodies. It fed hope. Scholars still debate whether these communal pots were common or occasional, but oral tradition holds them close proof that hunger shrank when shared. Even festivals bent to survival. Midwinter gatherings, once feasts, became ration fairs where neighbors exchanged what remained. A song here, a jug of weak ale there, laughter masking thin supplies. For a night, hunger became community, and the memory of those nights lasted longer than the food itself. A quirky tidbit. The Bran Laws, early Irish legal codes, record obligations of neighbors. If your cow strayed and fed on another's field, you owed repayment, but they also record rights to help. In times of fire, famine, or flood, neighbors were bound to assist. Law turned compassion into duty. Refuse, and you faced not only gossip, but judgment. Survival wasn't private. It was regulated, reinforced by culture itself. And gossip mattered. Villages remembered who shared, who hoarded, who shut their doors. A family might survive one winter by refusing help, but they would find themselves isolated the next. In Ireland's small hamlets, reputation was currency. A kind neighbor could count on help in return. A selfish one might find no one answering when they knocked. A modern aside, think of borrowing sugar from a neighbor Then imagine that sugar is the only thing standing between your child and starvation. That was winter barter in medieval Ireland. Every knock at the door carried weight far beyond a favor. Stories around fires reinforced this truth. Legends praise generosity saints multiplying food heroes sharing cloaks. Tales warned against greed. Fairies stealing from misers. Curses falling on hoarders. Children grew up hearing that kindness kept communities alive and cruelty doomed them. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were social contracts disguised as myth. Even animals became part of neighborly networks. Families lent breeding cattle or shared grazing land, knowing cooperation meant more milk, more calves, more survival. Sometimes disputes erupted, whose goat ate whose turnips, but even quarrels proved the closeness. You can't fight over resources unless you share them first. When storms raged, huts huddled like people smoke from chimneys, mingling in the gray air. Neighbors trudged through snow, checking one another, ensuring the elderly hadn't frozen in the night. If someone was sick, others carried water or firewood. No family stood entirely alone. And when a death came, as it often did, neighbors gathered mourning, praying, and then quietly redistributing food to keep the living alive. Historians still argue whether medieval Irish villages operated more through kinship or geography, but the lived reality was simple. Everyone within shouting distance mattered. Winter forced solidarity. Survival wasn't an individual victory. It was a shared one. So tonight, as frost howls through the thatch and your fire wanes low, you know comfort lies not only in your own hearth, but in the glow of the one across the field. Tomorrow, you might carry coals there. The next day, they might bring turnips here. And together, step by step, hut by hut, the village endures. Step inside a medieval Irish hut on a winter night, and you'll notice something odd. It isn't just people huddled in the smoky dark. It's cattle. Big, shaggy, steaming beasts pressed against the same walls, chewing cud as if they too have rent to pay. The byre, the section of the hut reserved for animals, wasn't outside in some tidy barn. Often it was part of the home itself. Because in the brutal winters, cattle weren't only livestock. They were central heating. Cows were wealth in Ireland. They gave milk, butter, hides, and eventually meat. Laws, poems, and even insults revolved around cattle. To steal a cow was to steal survival. But in winter, their value doubled. Each beast was a breathing furnace radiating heat into the hut. Families built partitions of wattle or simple stakes, separating humans from animals by only a few feet. At night, the warmth seeped through a bovine blanket, far more reliable than damp wool. You imagine lying on straw, wrapped in cloaks, listening to the steady rhythm of cows shifting and snorting. Their breath fogs the air, mixing with peat smoke until the hut becomes a stew of smells. Wool grease, dung, smoke, and animal musk. Unpleasant, absolutely. But the alternative cold silence was worse. Scholars still argue whether families brought cattle inside only during harshest nights or kept them indoors all winter. Either way, the practice was common enough to shape the architecture of rural homes. Animals didn't just provide warmth, they offered security. A cow indoors was less likely to be stolen by raiders or desperate neighbors. Wolves prowled outside hunger, pushing them close to villages. Keeping cattle inside meant fewer midnight surprises. A cramped hut was safer than an empty byre outside. Of course, living with cattle wasn't charming. Space was limited, air was thick, and manure piled up quickly. Children woke to hooves shifting dangerously near their heads. Chickens fluttered, pigs rooted through straw goats' butted walls. It was noisy, smelly, and chaotic. But for medieval peasants, survival didn't smell of lavender. It smelled like dung and smoke, and you learned to be grateful for it. A quirky tidbit early Irish law, the Brand Code specified fines for injuries caused by animals indoors. If your neighbor's cow gored your child, you had legal grounds for compensation. Which tells us something important. Accidents happen often enough to require rules. Imagine trying to explain to a judge that yes, your son lost a toe, but it was the cow's fault, not yours. Survival, but with paperwork. Milk was another blessing of indoor cattle. Even in winter, some cows produced enough to give families a daily ration. Warm milk, straight from the beast, was nourishment and comfort, sometimes churned into butter or soured into curds. Children drank it before sleep bellies, warming against the chill. And when milk was scarce, people prayed to saints to keep cows healthy. Bridget, in particular, was invoked as guardian of cattle and dairy. Her name mingled nightly with prayers before bed. Cattle carried cultural symbolism, too. To own many cows was to be wealthy. Poems praised kings by the size of their herds, and insults mocked poor men as cowless. Even ordinary peasants measured prosperity in cattle. A hut with 2 beasts inside meant warmth, milk, and status. A hut with none meant desperation. Scholars still debate whether cattle functioned as currency or simply prestige, but in winter huts, their value was counted in degrees of warmth. Picture a stormy night wind, howling frost, creeping along walls, snow drifting at the door. Inside the hearth, smolders low families curl together, and cows shift heavily in the byre. Their bodies radiate heat, their presence steady. The smell makes you cough, but the warmth keeps you alive. Children giggle when calves nuzzle their hands. Mothers scold when goats chew tunics. Fathers sigh as pigs snore louder than men. Chaos, yes, but chaos with heat. A modern aside, imagine your central heating system mooing occasionally and dropping manure on the floor. That's the medieval setup, ugly, smelly, but effective. Folklore remembered cattle fondly. Stories told of miraculous cows who never ran dry-feeding villages through famine. Legends warned of fairies stealing milk or replacing cows with changelings. People left offering sprigs of herbs, bowls of milk to protect their herds. Because losing cattle wasn't just losing animals, it was losing winter itself. By February, fodder ran thin. Families cut rushes, dug up bog hay, or even fed cattle scraps of roots. Hungry beasts grew restless indoors, lowing deep into the night. Children stirred in fear, parents muttered prayers, and everyone prayed spring grass would come soon. Scholars still argue how often cattle starved in harsh winters, but famine records suggest both humans and animals perished when food failed. Yet the bond between people and cattle endured. Families stroked their hides, spoke softly to calm them, and treated them less as animals than companions in survival. In songs and sagas, cows became symbols of abundance, patience, and strength. To share a hut with them wasn't shame. It was pride, proof you had warmth when others shivered. When spring returned, huts opened, animals led outside, and the stench finally cleared. Fresh air rushed in, and people laughed with relief. But for months before, cattle had stood as guardians of warmth, protectors against frost. Their low voices mingled with human prayers. Their bodies radiated life into huts that might otherwise have frozen silent. So tonight, as you curl beneath your cloak, you hear a cow shift in the byre. Her breath clouds the dark. Her body radiates heat, and for once, the cold retreats. The hut may smell like a barn, but it feels like survival. And in medieval Ireland, that's the only perfume that mattered. Snow in medieval Ireland wasn't the postcard wonder we imagine today. No children making jolly snowmen, no glittering landscapes admired from cozy cottages. For peasants, snow was both enemy and reluctant ally. It choked roads, buried crops, and froze fingers. But it also preserved food-shielded fields, and strangely sometimes saved lives. In winter, snow decided your fate more often than you decided anything about it. You wake one morning, and the hut's doorway is blocked. Outside, a white wall leans against the wattle frame. The thatched roof groans under weight. Inside, light filters through the tiny smoke hole, faint and gray, making the whole hut glow dimly. The children whisper nervously, "Snow has sealed you in." The first task of the day is not food, not fire, it's digging out. Fathers and older sons grab spades, hacking a narrow tunnel through the drift. The doorway emerges only after sweat and curses steam rising from bodies despite the frost. Step outside, and the village is transformed fields, gone paths, erased neighbors' huts reduced to lumpy mounds. Silence reigns, broken only by crows circling above the white desert. Snow as enemy was obvious. Travel stopped. Roads vanished. Pilgrims, traders, or messengers were trapped. If sickness struck, no healer could come. If fodder for cattle ran out, no hay could be hauled from a neighbor. Isolation became lethal. Entire hamlets suffocated in loneliness, praying their stockpiles lasted. Historians still argue how common heavy snow was in Ireland, but annals record great snows that lasted weeks, freezing rivers solid and driving wolves into villages. Oral tradition remembered them vividly winters, when people burned furniture for fuel and cattle bellowed in hunger until they collapsed. Snow also destroyed roofs. Thatched huts sagged under wet weight. Families scrambled up sweeping snow away with crude brooms, slipping and sliding on icy straw. Fail, and the roof collapsed inward, straw and snow burying the hearth. One night storm could undo months of labor. Children cried, mothers cursed, and fathers patched desperately. The battle wasn't just against cold, it was against crushing white silence pressing from above. But snow had its strange kindness too. Food buried beneath it sometimes lasted longer. Root cellars blanketed in snow stayed colder, steadier, safer. Meat hung outside froze solid, preserved naturally. Families desperate for storage used drifts, like free pantries, burying turnips or fish beneath heaps. Scholars still debate whether peasants systematically used snow this way or stumbled into the trick, but evidence suggests nature sometimes became freezer rather than foe. Snow also offered water when streams froze. You trudged outside, scooped armfuls, melted them in pots over smoky peat fires. The taste was clean metallics, strangely refreshing compared to swampy water in summer. But melting snow took time, fuel, and patience, luxuries scarce in the hungry months. Still thirsty children learned to catch snowflakes on tongues, laughing briefly in a winter otherwise joyless. For livestock, snow was double-edged. Cattle trapped indoors stayed warm but grew restless. Goats and sheep, if driven outside, struggled to paw through drifts for grass. Sometimes they found it. Sometimes they collapsed in exhaustion. Farmers led animals to rivers where ice had cracked, letting them drink meltwater. Other times, desperate families cut rushes from frozen bogs and fed them to beasts. Snow dictated not just human survival, but animal fate. Lose animals, and you lost milk, meat, and wealth. Folklore remembered snow with awe. Tales warned of fairy winds bringing sudden whiteouts. Legends described saints calming storms or spreading cloaks to clear paths. Some even claimed banshees wailed louder on snowy nights, their cries carrying further in the muffled silence. Children grew up fearing blizzards, not only for hunger, but for spirits hidden in the white swirl. A quirky tidbit, in some accounts, snow was used medicinally. Cold compresses of packed snow treated fevers or swelling. It sounds practical now, but imagine peasants kneeling in drifts, gathering handfuls for a child burning with sickness. The same snow that threatened to kill might soothe pain at least briefly. Scholars still argue whether this was widespread or anecdotal, but it shows how people tried to turn even the enemy into ally. Snow also shaped calendars. Heavy falls delayed planting, froze plows in barns, and shifted feast days when travel became impossible. Priests postponed services, markets shut down, and weddings waited until thaw. Life bent to snow's will. The church might control souls, but snow controlled bodies. And yet snow created odd beauty. On clear nights, the moon reflected on endless fields, casting silver light brighter than torches. Villagers walked cautiously, but they walked. Some remembered the quiet crunch underfoot as oddly soothing, a moment when the world felt still. Children, when hunger eased, slightly played, throwing handfuls, sliding on frozen patches, laughing despite thin cloaks. Even peasants knew that sometimes survival meant finding brief joy, even in white misery. A modern aside, think of snow days from school, the joy of canceled classes. Now flip it. No school means no communal hearth, no shared food, no warmth of crowded halls, just more hunger at home. That was medieval snow, sometimes beautiful, often terrifying, always powerful. By March, thaw came. Snow melted into streams, flooded fields, turned roads into mud. Relief mixed with dread, because melted snow exposed what it had hidden: dead animals, collapsed huts, bare fields. Families mourned losses, patched roofs, and stepped carefully through muck. Snow's departure didn't end hardship. It only shifted it. Still, peasants remembered both sides. Snow was enemy that trapped, froze, and starved. Snow was ally that preserved, protected, and nourished. Survival meant learning to curse it and thank it often in the same breath. So tonight, as the hut groans under white weight, and you hear the muffled silence outside, you know snow is here again. You don't welcome it. You don't fight it. You endure it, enemy ally and constant winter companion. Cold, hunger, smoke, and filth didn't just make winters miserable, they made people sick. Coughs rattled through huts. Fevers burned in children's joints, swelled from damp floors. With no doctors nearby, peasants turned to what they had: herbs, brews, and charms. Medicine and magic blurred until you couldn't tell which cured and which only distracted. In medieval Ireland, survival meant trusting plants and prayers as much as peat and porridge. You picture a mother crouched near the hearth, stirring a clay pot. Inside, water simmers with bitter herbs, nettles, yarrow, maybe willow bark. The smell is sharp, grassy, almost choking. Children wrinkle noses, but when the brew cools, she presses a cup into a coughing child's hands. Bitter medicine swallowed reluctantly, but it might ease fever. Or it might just taste awful. Either way, the ritual matters. Herbal lore passed from grandmother to daughter, not from books. Few peasants could read. And even if they could, precious manuscripts of healing were locked in monasteries. Instead, cures lived in memory. This root for stomach pain, this leaf for bleeding, this flower for bad dreams. Historians still argue whether peasants truly knew plant properties or relied mostly on trial and error. Evidence suggests both some herbs worked, others only gave hope. Take willow bark. Chewed raw, it dulled pain thanks to natural salicylates, the ancestor of aspirin. Did peasants know the chemistry? Of course not. They just knew chewing bark helped aching joints. Nettles boiled became both food and tonic rich in iron. Garlic was pounded into poultices for wounds. Honey, if you had it dressed, cuts and soothed throats. Practical, effective if limited. But alongside these came more questionable brews. Foxglove leaves, for the heart, dangerous hemlock for pain, deadly, or mandrake root for sleep, hallucinatory, at best. Charms filled the gaps where herbs failed. If coughs lingered, mothers tied amulets around children's necks, carved crosses, sprigs of rowan, or tiny bags filled with herbs and whispered blessings. Some recited prayers while laying hands on fevered brows, murmuring both Latin words learned from priests and older rhymes remembered from ancestors. Were they Christian pagan, both in huts where faith and folklore braided together, no one asked. Skeptics today might laugh, but for medieval villagers, charms gave agency. Illness was terrifying, sudden, invisible, uncontrollable. A whispered spell, a knotted cord, a blessing scrawled on wood gave a sense of fighting back. And sometimes, through placebo or luck, people recovered. When they did, the charm's power was confirmed. Scholars still debate whether belief itself improved survival, but folklore insists it did. Animals, too, received medicine. A cow coughing in the byre meant disaster. No milk, no calves, no wealth. Families brewed herbal washes for livestock, sprinkled ashes in their fodder, or led them through smoke as fumigation. Charms for cattle were common prayers to bridged knots tied in tails, holy water splashed on udders. Protecting beasts was protecting families. There's a quirky tidbit about holy wells. Ireland is dotted with them springs and pools long sacred, later Christianized. Even in medieval winters, families trudged to these wells, scooped freezing water, and carried it home as medicine. Sick children were sprinkled fevers, doused, and charms spoken. Wells were said to cure eye infections, skin rashes, even madness. Scholars still argue whether the mineral content had genuine effects or whether faith carried the healing. Perhaps both. The darker side of medicine was fear of witchcraft. If a neighbor's brew cured when yours failed, suspicion rose. Was she blessed with secret knowledge? Or was she trafficking with darker forces? Women skilled in herbs often walked a thin line between healer and witch in their community's eyes. A child saved made them saints. A child lost turned them dangerous. But in most huts, practical healing outweighed fear. People mixed what they had tested, what worked, and passed stories of success. Boil this leaf, chew that root, whisper these words. Some remedies lasted centuries. Others vanished because they never worked at all. Either way, the desperate clung to them. A modern aside, imagine having no pharmacy, no antibiotics, no thermometer. Just weeds from your field, smoke from your hearth, and hope. That was medicine in medieval Ireland. Sometimes miraculous, sometimes deadly, always uncertain. Illness shaped winter life. Families rationed, scarce herbs, saved honey for fevers, and prayed fevers didn't sweep through villages. When plagues came, pox, dysentery, or worse, herbs and charms faltered. Entire communities weakened, huts filled with coughs, and neighbors avoided one another. Death felt close, and charms multiplied, plastered on doors and beds as last defenses. and yet many survived. Not because herbs were flawless, but because people endured. Their bodies adapted, their spirits leaned on rituals, and their communities supported them. A bitter brew of nettle tea might not cure a cough, but it warmed, hydrated, and soothed. A charm around a child's neck might not banish fever, but it gave parents comfort enough to keep trying. Survival was never guaranteed, but neither was surrender. So tonight, as smoke thickens and frost clings, you sip a bitter cup, brewed from roots dug last autumn. You cross yourself, then whisper an older rhyme just in case. The taste is sharp, but it steadies your breath. Maybe it's the herb, maybe it's belief. Either way, you cling to both, because in this hut, medicine and magic walk hand in hand through winter. Winter in medieval Ireland didn't just creep into huts, it sprawled across fields. Every morning, the land itself wore armor of frost. Grass lay flat, and brittle rivers crusted in ice, and soil hardened like stone. For peasants whose lives depended on farming fields weren't just scenery. They were the pantry, the promise of tomorrow. And in winter, those fields looked like locked doors with no key. You step outside at dawn. Breath plumes, white boots crunch over ruts of frozen mud. The field spreads before you, silvered with frost, glistening like jewels in the first weak sunlight. Beautiful, yes, but deadly. That sparkle means the earth is asleep. Crops are buried, and nothing will grow until thaw. You crouch, scrape at the soil, and find it stiff, unyielding. Plows wait, idle seeds lie in sacks untouched. Winter isn't planting season, it's waiting season. And waiting hurts when your stomach grumbles. Frost tested farmers' patience. If it came early, harvest shrank. If it lingered late, planting was delayed. Both spelled hunger. Annals describe years when frost gripped Ireland well into spring, leaving sowing so late that summer crops failed. Families leaned harder on stored oats, salted fish, and root pits, praying the fields would forgive the delay. Historians still argue how often these famine years struck, but evidence of mass hunger suggests they were frequent enough to scar memory. Signs in nature became weather forecasts. Farmers read frost like scripture. A thick white coating on grass at dawn. Bad luck for cattle grazing. Ice clinging to riverbanks in February. Planting would be late. Ravens flying low, red skies and morning omens of storms or longer cold. Superstition mingled with observation, because in a world without barometers, you clung to every clue. Snow added insult. Fields buried in drifts were impossible to work. Even animals refused to graze, pawing futilely at white crusts. Families gathered Russia's hay or scraps of stored fodder to keep cattle alive until grass returned. Lose cattle, and you lost milk and manure, two essentials for both diet and farming. Frost on fields wasn't just about crops. It threatened every link in survival's chain. And yet frost had its odd gifts. Hard ground made travel easier across boggy land. Streams frozen solid offered shortcuts where no road existed. Hunters tracked animals across white surfaces, footprints etched clearly in frost. Even fields themselves, though barren, sometimes benefited. Cold killed pests, hardened soil, and promised fertility after thaw. Scholars still debate whether peasants understood frost's long-term benefits or simply cursed it. But nature played its balanced destruction in one season renewal in the next. A quirky tidbit: medieval Irish law even accounted for damage caused by frost. The Brehon codes mention disputes when cattle desperate in winter trampled neighbors' frozen fields. Owners owed compensation for ruined land, even if no crops were growing. Survival may have been communal, but the law still protected property even under snow. The emotional toll of frost weighed heavy. Imagine standing in your empty field, knowing every ridge and furrow by heart, yet powerless to coax life from it. Hunger gnaws, hands itch for work, but the soil says no. Winter steals not just food, but purpose. Farmers trapped indoors grew restless, anxious, snapping at families. Stories tell of men, wandering fields, aimlessly scanning for signs of thaw, whispering prayers into frozen air. Religion entered the fields too. Priests blessed them on feast days, sprinkling holy water over icy ridges. Families walked boundaries, chanting prayers to keep land fertile, sometimes burying charms in corners of plots. Bridget's crosses were hung in huts and carried to fields, asking her protection until the soil softened. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were pagan remnants disguised as Christianity, but for peasants, they were insurance policies written in prayer. A modern aside, imagine being told your paycheck won't come for 4 months, and there's nothing you can do but wait. That was medieval farming in winter work, paused hunger, rising survival dependent on what you stored last year. Anxiety mixed with hope, every frost-covered morning, a reminder that your future lay under ice. Still, people found small ways to use the frozen fields. Children played sliding on icy patches. Hunters tracked hares and foxes across drifts. Families collected firewood from hedges along frozen paths. Some even spread ashes from hearths onto frozen soil, believing it would hasten thaw. Whether it worked or not, the gesture mattered. Action gave hope. By March, the frost loosened. Fields softened into mud streams, broke free, and plows creaked back into use. Families rejoiced, though work meant exhaustion. The first day of plowing felt like liberation, men driving oxen through thawed soil, women scattering seed with relief. Children laughed, running barefoot through muddy ridges, even if food still ran short. Frost's grip had broken, and with it, despair. But memory lingered. Every winter, people told stories of the hardest frosts, the year rivers froze solid, the year cattle starved, the year neighbors dug turnips from snow. Those tales were warnings, shaping how much to store, when to sow, how to endure. Frost on the fields wasn't just seasonal. It was cultural, etched into memory as surely as into soil. So tonight, as frost spread silver across fields outside your hut, you watch through the doorway. It glistens beautifully in moonlight, but you know its cruelty. Fields asleep, bellies hungry, hands idle. Still you whisper a prayer, hoping frost means renewal when spring comes. Because in medieval Ireland, every frozen morning carried not just fear, but the stubborn promise of life waiting beneath the ice.